welcome to the In the Tank podcast. The last vestiges of the media's credibility is going up in smoke. From ghastly journalistic blunders to headlines that twist and turn like characters in a Hitchcock thriller, we're going to break down how the media seems to be taking an axe to its own reputation, Jack Torrance style. Polls show public trust in the media is as low as the depths of Crystal Lake, and even Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon and the owner of the Washington Post, recently penned a chilling op-ed on America's growing distrust of the media. Join us as we talk about all of this and more on episode 471 of the In the Tank podcast.
How do you like my garbage truck? This truck is in honor of Kamala and Joe Biden.
That is right. Welcome, garbage people. Welcome to the In the Tank podcast. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendall. Joining me today, I've got a full crew. I've got Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
I'm doing well. Happy Halloween, all you garbage people out there, which constitutes our entire audience, I suppose. But yeah, this is our last podcast before the election. So 1 week from today, I wonder what our mood is going to be. I'm hopeful that it will not be one of despair, but we'll see.
Yes, the last segment of the podcast, we'll get into the idea that we're 4 or 5 days away from the election. We've got some predictions. So you got to buckle up for that one. Make sure to stay tuned to the end. But yeah, garbage people, maybe it's worse than Basket of Deplorables, which is what we were talking about a handful of years ago. But also joining us, we have Justin Haskins, Senior Fellow at the Emerging Issues Center here at the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
I'm doing good. I'm doing very, very, very well. I feel... I don't know. I'm a little bit worried about how optimistic I am about the election. That honestly is the scariest thing for me, is being too optimistic. It's something I'm not familiar with. It feels really weird. But I'm feeling very, 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 very hopeful. We'll get to that later in the show, just how hopeful I'm feeling. But I will give just a little bit of a teaser of where I'm at right now. A week ago, I went on national radio on Glenn Beck's show, and I told millions of people that I was 99% sure that Donald Trump was going to win. So that's how optimistic I'm feeling right now.
I think you used the word landslide, too. Did you use the word landslide? You did.
Electoral college landslide, not a popular vote landslide, but electoral college landslide. So we'll get into all that later, just how big of a landslide I'm envisioning. But it does worry me because I'm not an optimistic person by nature. Some people have referred to me as like the public policy angel of death. You know, that's usually how things work. So I'm a little bit scared, but I think it's looking good. I think it's looking very, very, very good. So I'm excited.
Pony soldier.
I'm not.
Also,
you know what? Just bringing that up. Joe's with me. Me and Joe were on the same page. I guarantee you, whatever Joe tells the public, me and Joe were on the same side on this one. I'm sure of that.
That's a good point. Also joining us, I think maybe for the first time on In the Tank, Jack McFarland, who is a research editor here at the Heartland Institute. Jack, how are you doing today? Good, sir.
I'm doing all right, Donnie. I've actually been on probably like 4 or 5 times before, but it's been a while.
Be true.
I'm doing all right. You know, I'm perhaps a little bit less confident than Justin is. I do think that Trump will likely win, but I also think that regardless of who wins, there will be complete anarchy for days, weeks, if not months.
Save our predictions for the end. We're going to save our predictions.
We've
got a lot to talk about. But yes, we'll
very
see.
normative point. But anyways, I also really enjoyed your Jack Torrance reference because, as you know, I'm about to start reading The Shining for the first time.
It is that time of year.
Stephen King splurge.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a lot to talk about, as you can see on the side column there. Going to be talking about Donald Trump on Joe Rogan, Trump's supposed Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, the Bezos article heard around the world, and then, of course, our election predictions at the end. But before we get to any of those topics, I do have to say, before getting into anything, that message that I put at the beginning of all of these podcasts, to basically, you know, if you're an audio-only listener, leave a review for us on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. And consider joining us a day earlier, because you're probably catching that show on a Friday or later, where we are live streaming this on YouTube and Facebook and Rumble and X. And you can join the conversation, so your comments and questions in the chat. Maybe we'll show your comments on the screen. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. And you could also help out the show by donating to the show, not by hitting that super chat functionality, because that has been disabled by YouTube. We have been demonetized, but you can still go to heartland.org/inthetank, donate directly to the show. That way YouTube doesn't take a 30% cut. Or if you don't want to spend a penny, but you do want to spend a couple of seconds helping out the show, you can do so just by hitting that like button, sharing this content, subscribing if you haven't already, or just leaving a comment under the video. All of those things help break through those big tech algorithms that prevent content like this from being shown to more people. But yes, it is Halloween, hence the Halloween-themed intro of the podcast there. I don't really want to spend too much time talking about Halloween. I will say that my kids are going as Woody and Buzz Lightyear. Very excited to go trick-or-treating with them later today. But first, we got to get through all of the important topics of the week, which I think maybe the most important thing that happened between today and last time that we were talking together was Joe Rogan and Donald Trump. So news broke last week that Trump was going to be on the Joe Rogan Experience, the most watched show in the world. The interview dropped on Friday night. Within 24 hours, the interview had 15 to 20 million views on YouTube alone, 34 million by the end of the weekend. Currently, it stands at 41 million. It is the second most viewed interview on the Joe Rogan channel, second only to an interview that was posted 5 years ago about aliens and stuff. It was a marathon interview lasting 3 hours, talking about everything from elections, election interference, what it was like to govern, policy issues like immigration, tax reform, some foreign policy stuff. And of course, you can't have a Joe Rogan interview without some conspiracy talk and some talk about aliens. So 3 hours long. Gentlemen, am I the only one that watched the entire thing? I watched all 3 hours. Can anyone else say that they did the same?
I did.
Oh, nice. Jim did.
No.
Justin, how much did you watch? Just clips?
Like 5 minutes.
Jack, how much did you watch?
Maybe 3 minutes. In
3 minutes. Oh,
Yeah.
you guys. See, this
What's
is
the
the
point?
thing. We have because it was the best interview, man. I swear. This thing was excellent. So, Jim, I'll give my take. You can give your take afterwards. We got to fill in these heathens that didn't watch the most important interview of this election cycle. But okay, I'll start off by this. There is different versions of Trump that are presented to us, right? There's the version of Trump that's presented to us by the mainstream media, right? This horrible guy that just wants to throw people in jail just because they're, not nice to him, whatever, right? This like second coming of Hitler. And then there's the version of him that you see when you watch his campaign rallies or his speeches where he's like presenting, he's giving a performance. And then there's this. And this is like the most human, most like real version of Donald Trump that I think that I have seen. He came off as like humble, modest, appreciative of the being given the role of president. And I don't think that you usually see that even in his rallies. In the first like 15 minutes, Joe Rogan was asking him questions about like what it was like to actually win the election. And he goes into the story talking about like the first time that he went into the White House, like as president, or at least as being elected, and just being blown away by the beauty of the White House and how he immediately wanted to see like the Lincoln bedroom. And he started going off about all of this history involved with Lincoln and the White House itself and all of that. And like, it came off as someone that was really appreciative of that position that he was just granted by the American public. And like the version of Trump that they try to paint in the media is like, oh, the White House is a garbage pile. You should see some of my Trump hotels. That puts the White House to shame. That did not come through at all. It was very humble. It was very candid throughout the entire 3 hours. He gave very candid takes on a bunch of different stuff, including, which I thought was maybe arguably the most interesting part of the entire interview, was when he was talking about Joe Rogan asked him, like, how many appointments do you have to make? Like, how many positions do you have to fill? And Donald Trump's like, oh, like thousands. He's like, personally, I have to do like a few hundred, and then those few hundred people appoint other people. And it was like, he talks about it like how it was almost like overwhelming. And then he was getting people coming up to him and, saying like, oh, you should fill it with this person. You should fill it with this person. And he was so overwhelmed by it. He was just basically saying like, all right, I guess I'll trust you and appoint these people. And like that alone just kind of shows you how, like, I don't know, maybe this isn't the proper phrasing, but like how deep that swamp is and how much you have to like wade into it, as a president. But like he really came off as this like outsider person that just was foisted into the position of being president and just trying to like figure it out as he went along. It was very revealing interview, and I think in like a really good way. Jim, did you have the similar reactions to me, or was there something else that kind of stuck out to you?
No, I think all that is interesting. I mean, I watched 3 hours because it was, except for there was a part in the middle for about 40 minutes where they were talking about, mixed
UFC.
martial arts. That I'm not really a fan of UFC, so I just kind of, zoned out a little bit during that portion. But actually, what this interview and part of the theme of our podcast today is, the title of it is "Americans Don't Trust the News Media." The news media, as we know it, is dead, and it's. I was thinking this morning, it's like I watched The Sixth Sense again last week because I had a nephew who's a teenager who had never seen the movie before. So I kept my mouth shut so I wouldn't spoil the surprise. And he was like, "Wow, that was a shocking twist." But the media today is Bruce Willis. They're dead and they don't know it. And like, we see dead people. And those dead people are the media. And him going on Joe Rogan. So the media portrays Trump, and again, this is in the rundown, as a Nazi. Joe Biden, if you remember the red speech that he gave, the Dark Brandon red speech in front of, I think it was Independence Hall in Philadelphia, with red lighting and Marines standing in the background, very ominous and intimidating and imposing. He called the MAGA Republicans fascists. The dehumanizing of Donald Trump is the main political strategy of the Democratic Party. But when you sit down for 3 hours in a wide-ranging conversation where, as producer Andy reminds us, Donald Trump gets to do some weave, when he just kind of weaves from topic to topic, and it's hard to keep him down. And Joe Rogan even joked afterward that it was difficult for him sometimes to get Donald Trump back to what that Joe wanted to talk about. But that is not the traditional media interview. It's not confrontational. It's not, but it's actually very informative. And there are some important aspects about Trump and his previous presidency and what he wants to do in his next presidency that came out of that interview. But Joe Rogan said, I don't do interviews. I wanted to sit down and have a conversation. And that's the future of media. That's the future of our presidential elections. It's going to be, I can't even imagine the old debate format, which was absurd and has long been absurd, will be adhered to in the future. You're going to have, if you're going to be president of the United States, you're going to have to sit down with Joe Rogan or somebody else. It could be another big podcaster out there in another 4 years. But you're going to have to be able to sit down and have an adult conversation for hours on end in order to introduce yourself and explain yourself and to get the American people a chance to know you. He invited Kamala Harris on his podcast as well. She had ridiculous demands that he had to come to her, that she would only talk for an hour. And Joe Rogan's like, no, I think it's extremely important that my podcast is done in my studio and that it's a 3-hour conversation. And he said, I just wanted to have a conversation with Kamala, get to know her, let the American people get to know her. And she refuses to do that. And I think that's going to be to her detriment. I think it's harming her campaign, obviously. And I'm really actually quite excited that the long form podcast is going to replace the 60-minute sit down or the presidential debate or two chairs in Lester Holt talking to Donald Trump or something like that. I think those days are if not completely gone, almost all gone. And this is the future of media, and it's democratized media, as a matter of fact. And I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you can compare this where it's 3 hours straight, no edits, just these two guys. In the conversation starts, they hit record, goes for 3 hours, and then they hit stop. Compare that to the 60 Minutes interview that we talked about with Kamala, where it was chopped up. They basically allowed her to answer the question multiple times, took her best cut, and put it out there. Like it's a polished thing that's basically made for campaigns like that. Completely the opposite with this, so much more off the cuff. And then there was a question. I don't know if this was me and you, Jack, talking about this, or maybe it was somebody else. But it was like, did this move the needle? And a lot of people say like, oh yeah, certain things that happen, like whatever, like it doesn't move the needle. Everyone's preaching to the choir, that sort of thing. I think that this might have actually moved the needle for some people that kind of see themselves as in the middle, because Joe Rogan, the audience of it is obviously not primarily those that are like political activists or something. There's a lot of people that are just tuning into it because of the interviews that he does with comedians or the interviews that he does with UFC people. Like I have pieces of anecdotal evidence just myself of people telling me of situations where they're like, oh, are you going to watch the Trump on Joe Rogan interview? And just like, I didn't expect you to care about that. So I wonder if there is like a sizable amount of people that saw Trump in a different light and not just this one painted by like the media complex. But Jack, do you have any interest in watching it? Do you think that it moved the needle? Do you have any comments on this story?
Yeah. So first of all, I think I will watch it. And then I learned this morning that JD Vance actually flew in to Austin yesterday to record a podcast with Joe Rogan as well. And that's going to be released in the next couple of hours. And that at least that's what the Newsweek article that I read told me. So we'll see how that may move the needle too. I do think that it has the potential to move the needle slightly because, as you mentioned, Joe Rogan's audience is very much like the anti-institutionalist crowd. And as we know, much of the mainstream or much of the like populist conservative movement has that same sort of anti-institutionalist ideology. And so I think that a lot of those people that watch Joe Rogan may have removed themselves from the political conversation quite a bit, and maybe having the ability to see Donald Trump for 3 hours may incentivize them to actually vote this time around.
Yeah. Justin, I'm happy to go to a different topic here since you didn't watch it. But do you have any comments about this? I'll give you an option to comment on it.
Yeah, my comment is that I think it is really, I agree with everything that Jim said. I think it's really important. I think that this is the future of media. I think people are slowly but surely learning that the old style presidential debate type format is stupid and doesn't make any sense. It made sense back when network television was the primary way people consumed media. But now that we have the option of sitting down with someone for 3+ hours, which isn't really possible on network television in a realistic way, this is the future of media. Joe Rogan and people like that are going to be the sort of the biggest names in media going forward into the future. I think all that is true. With that said, I think although it's possible that this may have moved the needle a little bit, I think the reason I didn't watch it, and the reason I'm not that tuned into this thing and JD Vance and all, because I think it's already done. I think it's over. I think it's too late at this point in the race for it to matter all that much. So if this had happened, like say a month ago, I think it would have been more powerful. I think it happening at this point in time is probably a signal that Trump believes he's going to win. because I don't know, even if you're Donald Trump, and I know that he's got like a fairly, I don't think he feels like he's going to be mistreated by Joe Rogan, but doing 3 consecutive hours of an interview with anybody is a huge risk. A huge risk. Like just a gigantic risk. And I feel like you don't take that risk unless you feel pretty good, or you feel like you have to because you're way behind and you've got no choice, right? So it's kind of like one or the other. And I feel like in this particular case, Trump did it because he felt like he was in pretty good shape anyway. And I think that Kamala probably would want to do it, but she doesn't want to do it. It's a risk reward thing. She probably needs to do it, but the idea of her sitting down for 3 hours with Joe Rogan grilling her on certain things that she knows she's not going to be able to answer very well is probably more risk than out. So she doesn't want to do it for that reason. So that's, I guess, the reason. The big thing for me was like, I think this is really important. It's great. And it's a huge step forward for a lot of different reasons. But I also am like, this would have been more impactful if this had happened like a month ago. So
yeah, it's, I don't know. It's it was a very interesting thing to watch. And I think it's like represents a pretty interesting kind of moment in history. So I'll just leave it at that. But I will say that there were stories going around about like whether or not YouTube was suppressing this. And there was one article that I have in the New York Post. I'll just briefly read this. We don't have to really comment on it, but it says, a search on YouTube for the terms Joe Rogan Trump or Joe Rogan Donald Trump did not bring up Friday's 3-hour sit down at the top of the list. The Spotify interview was also notably absent from YouTube's trending page on Monday. Instead, users were offered results from traditional media outlets like The Hill, MSNBC, and Fox News and their coverage of the interview. And I will also offer, again, another piece of anecdotal evidence. I was trying to find the interview, just like on my phone, when I was preparing the notes for this, just to see kind of what the latest number of it was. And I also typed in Joe Rogan Trump, and I scrolled. I was scrolling. I couldn't find it. So I had to go back through my history page and scroll to like whenever the day was that I finished the interview and find it that way. So I don't know if that's some underhandedness. You would think that a video that got 41 million views in 5 days would be, at the top of the list search results when you look for it. But, that's I don't know. I'll just leave it at that. You can speculate as you want. But Joe Rogan's the most popular show and a perfect example of the new media and how the new media is just straight eating the lunch of the mainstream media. And, do we need a better example of why new media is eating the lunch of mainstream media than this next topic that we're going to talk about? Because I think this really illustrates it well. And that is Donald Trump's supposed Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden. So this is all they could talk about. And actually, as a side note, just before we get into this, I think that like what's telling about how well the interview did with Joe Rogan, how well it went, was the fact that the media didn't really talk about it that much. Like if he like had a couple of blunders or something, or he had some misstatements or whatever, right? Like, man, they would put that all over the place constantly and talk about how it was a big failure, but they didn't. They just ignored it. And that's how you know that it actually went well. But anyways, Trump's Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. This has got to be, I feel like I say this all the time, but like really, this has got to be one of the most egregious media narratives that I've ever seen the mainstream media run with. Like, this is just absurdity. So why did they spin this narrative? Because Trump was holding a rally in a building that has the same name as another building named Madison Square Garden that had a Nazi rally in it roughly 85 years ago. That's it. That is literally it. Because of that, they ran this narrative of Trump holding a Nazi rally. And some people might have been led to believe that the rally took place on the anniversary of this 1939 Nazi rally. Nope, not the case. The 1939 rally took place in February. Donald Trump's took place like a week ago in October. Some people might have been led to believe that this was the same building. No, not the case. The current building was built in 1959 in a different location than the previous iterations of Madison Square Garden. And some people might be led to believe that the venue has only ever been used one previous time for a Nazi rally in 1939 and then abandoned until Trump decided to reopen it so that he could hold a rally of his own. Again, not true. This venue in its current and former iterations have been used thousands and thousands of times by sports teams and musical acts and other political rallies, you name it. In fact, the DNC itself hosted 4 separate conventions at Madison Square Garden, including the 1992 one where Bill Clinton accepted the presidential nomination for his party. So it's all absurdity. And it all stems from like I said, the media ran with it, but it does stem from one person in particular, one person that has just had a thorn in their foot from Donald Trump for a number of years, and that's good old Hillary Clinton. So I want to play a clip here of some of these people spinning this narrative of Trump's Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. Can we go ahead and play the first half of that clip?
Trump has descended into madness over the last few weeks. And I think some of you don't miss on this. Go do your Google on this. Donald Trump's got this big rally going at Madison Square Garden. There's a direct parallel to a big rally that happened in the mid-1930s at Madison Square Garden. And don't think that he doesn't know for 1 second exactly what they're doing there.
You know, one other thing that you'll see next week, Caitlin, is Trump actually reenacting the Madison Square Garden rally in 1939. I write about this in my book.
I'm 94 years old.
You're muted, Donnie.
Let's go to Jim. That was I was just doing
Pulling a me.
a reference for you. But Jim, seriously though, how can these people honestly take themselves seriously? Like, is there no shame? Is there no shame? What are your thoughts?
There is no shame, and I think we do need to take them very seriously. I mean, they tried to kill this man twice, 2 assassination attempts in 5 weeks this summer. Undoubtedly egged on by this kind of eliminationist rhetoric. Remember that stuff? Remember they used to accuse Donald Trump of using eliminationist rhetoric. This and I say on this podcast all the time, everything that the left and the Democrats do is projection. All of it. It's projection all the way down. And so they know exactly what they're doing. They want Donald Trump to be taken out. They tried to get him arrested. They have all of these trumped up charges that are not crimes in several jurisdictions. They wanted to put him in jail so that he couldn't be president. Then they start cranking up this rhetoric so that people will take shots at him and kill him to stop him from being president. And then they stop doing that for about 20 minutes and then crank it up again. Tim Walz was given an opportunity by a local reporter to walk back this Nazi rally stuff and calling Trump's supporters Nazis as well, which is, again, echoing what our own president, Joe Biden, did, 2 years ago, calling all of Trump's supporters, the MAGA Republicans, fascists. This is the kind of dangerous rhetoric that they accuse Donald Trump of engaging in, but he does not. And this is a sweeping accusation against half this country. We are garbage people. We are Nazis. Donald Trump is a fascist. You're a fascist. This is, it's, you asked Donnie, can we take these people seriously? Do they even take themselves seriously? Damn right they do. They are sick in the head. All these complaints about how our politics is broken and is so divisive. Even Kamala Harris in her closing argument speech that she gave in front of the Ellipse in Washington, D.C., which stupid Joe Biden was kind enough to stomp all over by calling all of Trump's supporters garbage. Fantastic. So like another great moment for Joe Biden there in his political career. But even that, it's a supposed unity speech and that we need to unite the country. They are still constantly dividing people into these sorts of camps where everybody who just dares to disagree with them are Nazis and fascists. And this is, I am a full-throated supporter of free speech. And I think we need to be very careful about labeling any kind of speech dangerous. But this constant messaging from our media and from prominent Democratic elected officials like Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and Joe Biden, and then right there Hillary Clinton. This stuff needs to be punished politically at the ballot box on Tuesday. They have to learn they must learn the hard way that you cannot engage in rhetoric like this and win. They're trying to scare their opponents by lying to them about Donald Trump being a fascist and all of his supporters being fascist, and the absurdity of Madison Square Garden being picked specifically. That's what Tim Walz said. He said, don't you have any illusions that Donald Trump didn't know exactly what he was doing? That is unhinged, crazy talk. And it's done on purpose. It seems to me that the Democrats don't think they can win an election unless the electorate is grossly misinformed about the state of their country and about the nature of their political opponents. And to put it into this kind of rhetoric is disgusting. And again, it needs to be punished at the ballot box on Tuesday, so that this kind of rhetoric, I would hope, eventually just disappears, and we can start talking to each other like Joe Rogan talked to Donald Trump, like intelligent adults.
Yeah, Justin, I mean, I would have ignored this story if it was literally just Hillary Clinton out there just shouting into the wind like she tends to do. But this was literally picked up by much of the media. You can just Google this and you'll find like a bunch of different articles, some of them criticizing it, but a lot of them just talking about it. And like even MSNBC in their coverage, I have a screenshot. I don't know if we have it ready or anything like that, but there was a screenshot that was shared with me of MSNBC's coverage of the event. And on their little chyron at the bottom of their thing, it said Trump's MSG rally comes 85 years after pro-Nazi rally at famed arena. Like, that's their takeaway. So it's not just Hillary Clinton. It's a larger share of the media that was trying to make this comparison of Trump being a Nazi. Obviously, the going into the election, or the last couple of weeks of the election, the biggest narrative that the Kamala Harris campaign is trying to spin is that Trump is Hitler 2.0. This just goes along with it. But man, again, is this not one of the most egregious narratives you've seen the media try to spin?
Yeah, I mean, it's what, honestly, it's what you would at this point expect from them. I mean, I'd be surprised if they weren't doing this sort of thing at this point. I think they're desperate to win. I think that their message of joy, remember that? Remember when joy was the big campaign slogan for like a week, and then that didn't work out so well. So then they moved to, Hitler rhetoric. Like we went from joy to this guy's Hitler, like pretty quick. Yeah. I think like it's desperation. It's all they have. I think the polling is showing, actually, when they talk to undecided voters, the polling is showing that the things they're most concerned about with Trump are just sort of him and his personality. And they're maybe a little bit unsure about whether he's like a reckless person or something like that. Those kinds of narratives do well with undecided voters to make them feel uncomfortable about voting for him. On all the issues, Trump is winning. So they have to pick on the things that they think are going to give them the best chance of coming back here in the election, because they're down in the polls. And I think that this is one of those issues. What's so incredible about it, though, is, the idea that Trump is a fascist, whatever you think of Trump, if you hate Trump or whatever, that's fine. But the idea that the guy is a fascist, that he's somehow in line with fascism, is completely absurd. Completely historically inaccurate. Fascism is on the left side of the political spectrum. Like, no question about that whatsoever, on the American ideological spectrum. In Europe, it's on the right side, but that's because the right-left spectrum in Europe is completely different than the right-left spectrum in the United States. The Nazis were a socialist party. They were the National Socialist Party in Germany. That's what they were. They were left-wing people. The primary difference between them and, say, the communists, who, by the way, were allied with each other early on in World War II and then later on split apart, is more about nationalism versus internationalism. But that has nothing to do with fascism in and of itself. So the idea that there's some sort of ideological similarity between the Nazis and Trump is completely absurd. The Nazis were big government people, not limited government people. They wanted more government control of the economy. That's what fascism is all about. There's nothing that Donald Trump has done that's been in line with that. Hitler was the most pro-war leader in modern history, like the last 100 years. He loved war. He was starting wars all over the place. Trump has been one of the few American presidents over the last 30 years who's been trying to get out of wars and stop wars. He's been one of the least pro-war presidents we've had. So there's literally nothing. And then I'll add this, because I think Jim mentioned earlier, the left loves to create these narratives that actually applies to themselves. So I just wanted to point out two incredible, just absolutely amazing instances of hypocrisy here that's going on. One, there were actually anti-Nazi rallies also hosted in New York City at Madison Square Garden.
Right.
So we could have just as easily picked that and said, well, there's a, this is just like the anti-Nazi one, right? But no, we're going to pick the pro one, which makes no sense. Number two, the Democrats in the progressive era actually had a very favorable view of Hitler and the Nazis early on, prior to World War II. And this was well documented. This that I'm going to read, which is, I won't read all of it, I promise, but this comes from the Jewish Virtual Library. It's from this think tank that exists that's trying to improve American-Israeli relations, that sort of thing. Did a whole article about Franklin Roosevelt's pre-war attitude toward Hitler. Okay, so I'm just going to read little snippets of it so you can see what I'm talking about. From the time FDR took office in 1933 until America entered World War II in December 1941, the Roosevelt administration's policy was to pursue cordial, sometimes even friendly relations with the Nazi regime. Later on, he goes, FDR, he's giving examples of this. FDR sent Secretary of Commerce Daniel Roper to address a pro-Nazi rally in New York City in 1933. At that rally, Nazi Germany's ambassador to the United States was the keynote speaker, and the podium and hall were decorated with swastika flags. In 1937, the administration sent one of its senior diplomats to represent the United States at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. The Roosevelt actually sent someone to Nuremberg in 1937 to represent America at an actual Nazi rally. Think about that. That's just incredible. Then there's numerous examples. Roosevelt repeatedly compelled the Secretary of the Interior, a guy named Harold Ikes, to remove critical references to Hitler from his speeches. For example, in the draft of his May 1935 commencement address at the University of Alabama, Ikes described universities in Nazi Germany as, quote, mere bond slaves to a strutting and vainglorious Nazism, and that those in fascist Italy are permitted to teach only what the government permits them to teach. The White House informed Ikes that it, quote, it is the president's request, meaning Franklin Roosevelt, that the references to the foreign countries be entirely eliminated. There are dozens more examples of this. And Henry Ford, there's all sorts of people on the Democratic side in the progressive era who were well known to be pro-Nazi prior to World War II. So the idea that there is this ideological alignment on the right, on the American right, to Nazism is completely historically inaccurate. If anything, it's the other way around. And of course, today I would never say that that Kamala Harris is pro-Nazi or whatever. She's not, obviously. But it's just completely absurd to make the case that Trump or the Republicans or any of those people who were always, even 100 years ago, completely pro-Nazi, anti-Nazi, that they have some sort of ideological affiliation or affinity for that, for fascism or for Nazism or anything like that is completely absurd. Again, if anything, that's a Democrat Party problem, not a Republican Party problem.
Jim, you were saying that the MSNBC coverage of this even went further than what I presented. Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, you actually do have to see it and hear it to believe it. I know, Andy, if you want to pull that up and we can all watch it together. Starting at the beginning.
That jamboree happening right now, you see it there on your screen, in that place is particularly chilling because in 1939, more than 20,000 supporters of a different fascist leader, Adolf Hitler, packed the garden for a so-called pro-America rally. A rally where speakers voiced anti-Semitic rhetoric from a stage draped with Nazi banners. When a Jewish protester rushed the stage, the Associated Press reported, quote, instantly, a dozen or more stormtroopers set upon him, knocking him down and beating him as he held his head in his arms. Most of his clothing was torn from his body. Later, he was booked for disorderly conduct. Now, against that backdrop of history, Donald Trump, the man who has threatened to use the military against opponents he calls enemies from within, who has threatened to use the troops to quell what he says are lawless cities, and to use those troops to carry out mass deportations of immigrants, is once again turning Madison Square Garden into a staging ground for extremism.
Yeah, I wish it was just a joke. It isn't a joke. I mean, you know, our next item here is Bezos' article on declining trust in media. The reason the American people don't trust the media anymore is because of this kind of garbage. What the F does a Donald Trump rally, Madison Square Garden, have to do with a Nazi rally in 1939? Nothing. It has nothing to do with it, is the obvious answer. And here you have a host on a major network in our legacy mainstream media, MSNBC, overtly going on and on and on, and overtly comparing a gathering of patriots who support Donald Trump to a Nazi rally. And as you talk about, as we described it, you have to, when you see that video, it should get you even angrier. And the media has destroyed itself. This, you know, I've been thinking a lot over the last couple of days that I think this election is, I think it's a chance for America to try to return to normalcy, so that we don't have these sorts of things anymore. I mean, our entire culture and politics have seemed to have gone absolutely batshit crazy, from the policies enacted to, you know, open borders and biological males playing girls' sports and going into girls' locker rooms. All of these crazy leftist policies that have been put in place by the Biden and Harris administration over the last 4 years. Can you believe it, guys? Can you believe it? That the vote to return to normalcy means voting for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of all people, is the sane and normalcy vote in this election. It's just amazing where we are today, and it is disgusting. And so, yeah, you know what? They were getting on Donald Trump for saying, yeah, you know, if you guys are going to continue to just spew out propaganda like this, maybe you shouldn't have free access to the airwaves like you do in our spectrum licensing agreements with the big major networks. Hey, NBC News, you might want to rein in these complete radical nut jobs who are broadcasting things like this and are serious about it and are producing nothing but lies and propaganda. And so when Donald Trump says, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have free license to the air that the American people own, that's not a radical thing to say, because it's spurred by disgusting propaganda and lies like this.
Oh, yeah, no, that video triggered me. Jack, I do want to move on to the next, our main topic, honestly. We're already 45 minutes in, but our main topic's coming next. But Jack, I want to give you an opportunity to comment on this story before we move forward.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Jim and Justin did a pretty darn good job of explaining it all, and I agree with everything that they said. But I'll just say this. So, you know, dehumanization of the other side is a pretty classic totalitarian tactic. And I just think it's ironic that the same people that are calling us Nazis and fascists are using that tactic to their own political ends. And that plays into what Justin was referencing about how it's really the leftward side of the aisle that has historically and currently shared more commonality with fascism than the rightward side of the aisle, at least in the United States. The pillar of fascism is the concept of corporatism, which is the alignment of the power of the state with the power of big corporations and business. Ask yourself, which party has aligned itself more and tried to control big corporations and big business, especially in the past decade and a half? It certainly isn't the Trump administration. Now, I'm not going to sink so far as to do exactly what the mainstream media is doing and call Joe Biden and Kamala Harris fascists, but think about it, you know, whether it's ESG, whether it's central bank digital currencies, whether it's censorship of social media, whether it's the mainstream media essentially becoming Pravda for the Biden administration. The examples are endless, and it is simply misdirection and projection on the part of the mainstream media, the Democrat-aligned mainstream media, because they are trying to distract us all from the fact that they actually have significantly more commonality with fascism than the populist. Right.
Yeah, but did they have a rally at Madison Square Garden? Because put aside all of the things that you said, I mean, come on, let's look at the facts here. Let's be honest.
You're not wrong.
Yeah. So let's move on. We got to get to our main story here. So, last week, news broke that for the first time in 36 years, the Washington Times would not endorse the Democrat.
Post.
Oh yeah, sorry. The Washington Post would not endorse the Democrat candidate for the presidential election. I actually went back and looked, and for the past 10 elections that they put in the endorsement for, it was for the Democrat. This drew outrage by many on the left, including Washington Post staff who resigned over to the decision. It also led to a wave of losers to cancel their Washington Post subscriptions. Again, outraged that the newspaper they want to get their news from isn't being completely outwardly biased towards one political party this election cycle. This and some surely other factors led Jeff Bezos, head of Amazon and owner of the Washington Post, to write an op-ed in the Post titled "The Hard Truth: Americans don't trust
which is
the
opinions
news media."
All right.
That's right. Americans don't trust the news media. And first, I want to talk about the article itself, and then we can get into some of the issues surrounding the story and even some of the speculation, because I was talking to Justin yesterday about this, and there is some pretty interesting stuff out there. But first, let's talk about the article. So Bezos gets right into it, where in the opening paragraph, he says, in the annual public surveys about trust and reputation, journalists and the media have regularly fallen nearly to the very bottom, often just above Congress. But in this year's Gallup poll, we have managed to fall below Congress. Our profession is now the least trusted of all. Something we are doing is clearly not working. Andy, do me a favor and click on that Gallup poll link there in the middle of that first paragraph. This is very interesting. Scroll down to the first chart there. This poll shows that 31% of Americans have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the news media. This number has obviously been declining over the past few decades, according to this chart. 33% of Americans have, so more than 33% of Americans have not very much trust in the mass media. And the most alarming part about this is that 36% of Americans polled in this Gallup poll have zero trust in mass media. So between the group that has zero trust and the ones that have not very much, that accounts for 69%. So that's not very good. So Bezos goes on to write, let's see, most people believe the media is biased. Anyone who doesn't see this is paying scant attention to reality, and those who fight reality lose. Reality is an undefeated champion. It would be easy to blame others for our long and continuing fall in credibility and therefore decline in impact, but a victim mentality will not help. Complaining is not a strategy. We must work harder to control what we can control to increase our credibility. He then goes on to address some of the speculation that's been, leveled at him behind the lack of presidential endorsement and his perceived role at the Washington Post before writing this. Many people are turning to off-the-cuff podcasts, inaccurate social media posts, and other unverified news sources, which can quickly spread misinformation and deepen divisions. The Washington Post and the New York Times win prizes, but increasingly we talk to only a certain elite. More and more, we talk to ourselves. It wasn't always like this. In the 1990s, we achieved 80% household penetration in the DC metro area. While I do not and will not push my personal interests, I will also not allow this paper to stay on autopilot and fade into irrelevance, overtaken by unresearched podcasts and social media barbs. Not without a fight. It's too important. The stakes are too high. Now more than ever, the world needs a credible, trusted, independent voice. So, Jim, I want your reaction first on this. Your reaction as somebody who, A, worked in the media machine before, and B, probably harbors the most resentment out of anyone towards the mainstream media. So what are your reactions to Jeff Bezos' article here?
Yeah, I was a reporter at the Washington Times. I covered Congress and I covered the White House. I traveled on Air Force One and in the White House press plane covering George W. Bush's reelection campaign in 2004, and then his first year as a reelected president in 2005. I can tell you that I know, or at least knew, a lot of the reporters that are still working for the legacy media are still with those outlets today. They were biased then. They are biased now, but it's now gone into a place of absolute crazed absurdity in their bias. And I am glad I'm no longer a journalist. It's a shameful profession. And for what Jeff Bezos's letter here misses what's really wrong. And it's that if he really wanted to get journalism back to the objectivity standard, which was never really truly objective, but if he wanted to get back to what it was in the 1990s, which was merely, compared to now, gently biased against conservatives. Back in the 90s when I was a reporter, the kind of the worst or most easily identifiable bias you would see, for instance, I was covering Congress. The Washington Post would frame every proposal by a Republican in the worst light possible. And the story would always start with like how, Democrats oppose it, but every Republican proposal was just put in the worst light possible. They were never given the benefit of the doubt, and every Democrat proposal was always presented as a good idea, and that Republicans are standing in the way. I would dream of that kind of bias today, because now our media is not in the business of actually informing voters and Americans about what's going on in the world. Their job is to be propagandists for the deep state, for any Democratic regime, and for the Democratic Party in general. That is their entire job. Just from that MSNBC clip we had there, the lies were coming so fast and furious in that MSNBC clip that we had that it just goes through one ear and out the other when he said that Donald Trump has pledged to turn the military against the American people. That's not what he said. He didn't say anything remotely like that. He said that he would employ the National Guard if necessary, if after the election, radical leftists from Antifa and BLM take to the streets and start burning our cities down again. That's what he said. And the reporters at the Washington Post and MSNBC that keep saying this lie actually know it's a lie. It is not difficult to figure out what Donald Trump actually says and to put it in the proper context. But they're not in the business of doing that. That's not what our media does anymore. So if Jeff Bezos was actually serious about using the Washington Post as a new beacon of objectivity and useful and important journalism in America, he would fire at least half of the writers at that paper. Certainly fire every reporter who signed a letter, denouncing him for not endorsing their gal Kamala Harris. And the idea that the reporters at the Washington Post are not satisfied with how negative the coverage is of Donald Trump, that they're not going after him hard enough, that they're not calling him a Nazi often enough. This is absolutely absurd. So Bezos should fire half of his reporters, and he should actually make a good faith effort to go out there and hire actual non-leftists to be reporters at the newspaper. Fire the editors who assign these stories and frame them in a way that treats half this country as a grave threat to our democracy. That Jeff Bezos is not going to do that. The New York Times is not going to do that. The Washington Post should actually also, as a cherry on top, return the Pulitzer Prize that it earned and brags about for reporting the lie of the Russian collusion hoax for 4 straight years. He should apologize for that, be embarrassed about that, explain to his readers how the hell they even let that happen, and how they let that happen is because they're ideological biased, and they were mouthpieces for the deep state that was out to destroy Donald Trump. Now, those are the minimum things Jeff Bezos has to do to restore credibility just to his little house organ newspaper that he bought as a hobby. But he is not going to do that. And so it's going to be great that he's going to keep losing money. What I think the paper loses $70 million a year. It's not easy to lose $70 million a year, but somehow Bezos and his staff at the Washington Post have figured out how to do it. It's going to be nice to see that the Washington Post and the New York Times and all of these newspapers and all of these legacy media outlets are just declining in credibility and relevance in our politics and in our culture. And that's just the way it's going to be, because there is no interest in the people, no matter if they're billionaires that own these outlets, or if they're the editors and writers who produce the product for these outlets. There is no interest. They have no interest whatsoever in restoring any sense of credibility or fairness. That's the most obvious thing you can see.
Well, so I'm whether or not you believe in what Bezos is saying in terms of like whether or not he means it is one thing. That's a whole nother discussion. But I was reading most of that article thinking like, yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with any of this. I mean, I think that he was kind of throwing this idea of unverified, podcast or off the cuff podcast or whatever the remark was.
Yeah, I got it right here. I got it right here. Off the Tough podcast, inaccurate social media posts and other unverified news sources, which can quickly spread misinformation and deepen divisions. There is no greater purveyor of misinformation over the last 4 years than our so-called legacy media.
Right.
None.
But like
zero.
But I'm reading all of that, and I'm like, yeah, I kind of agree with this. Like, I know that we could probably take offense to it and assume that he's lumping in our very researched podcast into that group. But, I think for a society, like, it would be very valuable to have, like, a newspaper of record or whatever they like to present, the New York Times as, right? That's what they say, newspaper of record. Like, some actual media that you can trust as a society. As you said, Jim, and as Bezos seems to be recognizing, like, that credibility is gone. That is down the tubes so far that you can't even see it. So, again, whether or not you trust what he's saying, what he'll be able to follow through is one question, but I feel like I pretty much agree with a lot of what he says in there. Jack, you and I were talking about this. Are you still on that same wavelength, or what are your comments on this?
I am definitely still on that wavelength. So the best way to say it would be this. The current environment that we have, where the vast majority of people are getting their information from social media, whether it's X or Facebook or Instagram, is rife with misinformation and is rife with manipulation. I mean, I was looking at a study or just like a data analysis from Statista. And in 2022, 47% of all people aged 18 to 34 get their news from social media, whereas only 6%, for example, get it from local newspapers. And I think that, the current environment that I was describing, while it's better perhaps than the current mainstream media, it's not the best solution. The best solution is to have a group of large media outlets that are objective and non-biased and serve as a trusted source of information. Now, the question, of course, is how do we get there? I don't think that there is any redeeming the Washington Post or the New York Times. I think there will need to be a new grouping of institutions, and a big part of any sort of reform in that regard is going to have to be based on personnel. In another study that I was reading, I took some notes on it, but there was a study done in 2018 by the Journal of Expertise that studied the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal in particular, about 2,000 employees, and half of the people sampled attended what they called elite universities, so universities ranked in the top 30, and then 20% of the people sampled were from Ivy League universities alone. For context, approximately 1% of all college graduates come from Ivy League institutions. And so that means that Ivy League institutions are being overrepresented by a factor of 20 in these mainstream media organizations. Not to mention, there's the whole other problem of how in the past, probably before I was even alive, local newspapers served as a proving ground for many people that went to college for journalism. And they learned how to actually be journalists at these local newspapers. And then once they had proven themselves, they were hired by these larger, more reputable outlets like the New York Times. So the collapse of local media and local newspapers has created a situation where the New York Times is hiring some kid at the age of 22 that just graduated from Columbia, who has spent the past 4 years being indoctrinated by, these socialist professors and has become essentially just a left-wing nut job, for lack of a better word, and who has absolutely no experience in media and is therefore just going to parrot whatever, the people on their side of the political aisle are saying and protect them, because they don't have the ability to develop any sense of integrity. So there are a lot of problems, but overall, I agree that with you, Donnie, that the best situation is complete reform of these media organizations and probably creation of new ones, rather than just fragmentation into millions of different podcasts, most of which have a partisan agenda. We need common, trusted sources of information if we are going to retain any, or not retain, but reaccumulate any sort of national unity.
Yeah. So, Justin, I'm going to come to you next on here because, like earlier in the podcast, I was just talking about like new media and Joe Rogan, how they're eating the lunch of mainstream media, almost celebratory of that. But like, I also have to acknowledge, which I, kind of said so in some of that setup to the question to Jack, is that there is a lot of misinformation in these, like, ways that people get their social media or their information from social media and all of that. Just yesterday, I was watching like little YouTube shorts or something like that, or maybe something like that. And this little video popped up and it was Joe Rogan talking to Elon Musk. And they were talking about some story about like Samsung phones and their way that their camera uses AI to make it look like the moon is more in focus and all of that. And Joe Rogan is responding. And like by like halfway through the this little clip, it's like a minute long clip, I realized this isn't a clip section from an actual podcast of Joe Rogan and Elon Musk. It was a deep fake. It was a deep fake of those two. It was a fake interview between those two talking about some like viral, stupid like media story or whatever. And like, I'm aware of it because I'm so, deep into all of this stuff, but I think your average person doesn't. And if they see some video like that, where it's seemingly Joe Rogan and Elon Musk talking to each other, but it's just some AI generated from someone that's just trying to content farm, that opens the door to just a vast amount of misinformation spreading that I don't even think your average person can comprehend. So what are your thoughts on this Bezos article and whether or not you think that the mainstream media can be refurbished in some way or reclaimed in some way or anything like that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that what Bezos is doing here, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he's being a little more honest than Jim might be willing to give him be willing to admit or acknowledge or believe. And the reason for that is because I think that Bezos bought the Washington Post because he viewed it as an influential news source. That was the whole point. That was the whole reason he bought it. Okay. Now, in the time that he's owned it over the past decade or whatever it's been, the media, including the media that he purchased and spent all this money for, has become significantly less influential in society. And the key to knowing that that's the case is that if anything is true about the mainstream press over the past 8 years, it's that they don't want Donald Trump to be president. We can all agree on that. They don't want that. And yet it looks like he's about to become president again. So if you're Bezos, you're looking at this and you're saying, how influential could we possibly be after spending 8 years of talking about how Donald Trump is the devil and he's Hitler reincarnated and he's about to win re-election anyway? Well, we clearly have lost. Not the polling shows that. The Donald Trump's popularity shows that. A million other things show that too. So what do we do about it? And if you're Bezos, you're just looking at it purely from I want my newspaper to be influential again perspective. I think what he's saying is, really common sense. If I want my newspaper to be influential, I have to at least look like the newspaper has to at least look like it's objective, or at least not completely in the tank for whatever the left wants. And right now they don't have that. And so I think what happened in this particular case is he said newspaper endorsements are stupid. It's probably what he thought. They have no impact whatsoever on who wins, because if they did, then every president over the past 50 years would be a Democrat. So they are not having an impact. And what it signals very clearly is that we're a left-wing newspaper because we want the left-wing candidate to win. We're openly saying it. This idea that the editorial board can be separated at the newspaper from the news department, although that's true in a lot of ways, I just think the perception is that it isn't. And so he's saying this is a really easy way for us to make it look like we're not as biased as we actually have been. We don't want to look biased. And if we want to be influential again, we can't look as biased, and we can't be quite as biased as we've been. And I think that in the beginning of the Trump era, the goal was we have to stop Trump. We have to use all of our media might to stop him and never allow him to become president again. And we got to kill his administration. And they did everything they could to deal with that. And now I think what they're looking back on and they're reflecting on it, they're realizing, you know what? It didn't really work all that well. And he looks like he might be president again here pretty soon. So we got to do something differently. And I think that's what's going on here. I just think it just makes sense. Even if you want to say, well, Bezos doesn't really want the Washington Post to be fair and balanced. He probably doesn't. But what he at least wants to do is make it look like they're not quite as in the tank. I believe that that's the case. I think that's true. And there's actually been news stories that have come out since this story initially dropped that have suggested that Bezos has ordered the higher ups at the Washington Post to hire more conservative opinion writers, and not news writers, opinion writers, which is important and interesting. But I think that that's part of the same thing. I want the Washington Post to be more influential. I can't do that if everyone just thinks we're the far left-wing newspaper that only talks to Ivy, school educated elites. We have to go beyond that again. And I think that if at the bare minimum, it's about posturing. It's about looking like you're more fair and balanced at the bare minimum. And there is a possibility that he's saying, you know what? If we were a little more fair and balanced, we probably would do better in terms of the business and be more influential. And then when it really counts and we really need to leverage our influence into something else, then we can turn on the bias machine and make it a little more biased. But if everyone thinks we're biased all the time, what's the point? So I guess what I'm saying is I believe with probably 95% of what he wrote in the letter, I think he's probably telling the truth about 98% of what he wrote in the letter, but he's just, I think his motives are probably not as pure as they seem.
Sure.
But if you read it very carefully, he doesn't actually say that he wants the newspaper to be completely unbiased. He doesn't say that. He just says, we need to get more credibility again. And this is important for our credibility. And he talks a lot about credibility, which is really not the same as whether you're biased or unbiased. It's about the perception of whether you're biased or unbiased.
Sure.
And I think he cares a lot more about that. And so I hope the Washington Post does move a little bit more to the center. I hope all the mainstream media outlets move more to the center and become a better reflection of the country. I hope that happens. I'm skeptical, but I think that if Donald Trump wins this election, they might actually go in that direction purely because they've realized the other strategy is a losing strategy, and they're going to end up being completely irrelevant if they don't change.
Yeah, it's I mean, I had a whole nother segment planned on this story talking about like the reaction of the people at the Washington Post and these accusations that he's just trying to sidle up to. Bezos is just trying to sidle up to Trump because he thinks he's going to win and he wants to be in his good favor. Good. I hope that's what actually happened. I hope that Bezos realizes that he should be on Trump's good side and that he's doing all of this stuff. But we're gonna have to save that for another day because we are an hour and 10 minutes in, and I did promise that we were gonna make a series of predictions for the election in 4 or 5 days here. so that we can, first and foremost, so that we can all look stupid when none of these predictions actually occur next week when we come onto the show. But that's what we're going to do. So Justin had the idea to all of us to go to 270towin.com. Is that what it is? Yep. And make our predictions on their little electoral college map there. So I want to do mine last. I think we should go with let's go with Jack first. Let's show Jack's map here, what he thinks is gonna. We'll pull Jack up, and you can explain yourself. Jack, you've got Democrats 257, Republicans 281. Explain yourself.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a super conservative estimate, and honestly, I think it's going to be a wider margin than that. But that's based largely on just where battleground polling is right now. Plus, so I gave Nevada and Wisconsin and Michigan to Kamala Harris, and then I gave Trump the rest of the battleground states. And that's partially because there have been some shenanigans related to electoral processes in Nevada and Michigan in particular, and also Kamala seems to have the widest lead in Wisconsin. But I think that Trump very comfortably has Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. Pennsylvania is a little bit of a toss-up, but anyways, that's my reasoning. Okay. I do think it'll be a wider margin, but that's my conservative estimate.
Well, this is the one that you're going to have to live with. Justin, let's show Justin's map next.
Okay, so my analysis is based entirely on a theory I have about polls that suggests that the polls consistently get Trump wrong by about 3%. And by that 3 percentage points. And by that, what I mean is they tend to over sample and overrepresent the Democrat support. So Trump usually does about anywhere between 1 and 3 to 4 percentage points better in his elections than he does in the polls. Okay. And it's because pollsters, there's a whole bunch of theories for why that could be the case. We don't need to get into that, but maybe it's bias. Maybe it's just the way that they do polls now isn't a good reflection of reality. Maybe Trump voters some of them are too afraid to admit they're Trump voters to someone on the phone. There's all kinds of theories, but the point is that the polls very consistently show in all the big swing states that Trump is either tied, barely losing by less than like a point. But in fact, the state he's polling the worst in right now is Michigan, and he's losing on average in the polls 0.4 percentage points. Okay, that's his worst state. He's winning in all the other swing states, with the exception of Wisconsin, where it's 0.2 percentage points. And so if you just take what has happened in the previous elections and you just go down the line and you say, okay, in the Hillary Clinton in 2016 and in 2020, how did Trump do compared to the polls? And then you just apply a very similar analysis to the polls we're seeing right now, where Trump is doing infinitely better than he did in either of those two presidential elections. Of course, he won in 2016. What you end up with is a massive Trump landslide. So what I believe is that Trump will win every single swing state. Okay. I think there's a decent chance, and this is just based purely again on this analysis, not based on wishful thinking or anything like that. I think a state in my map that I listed as blue that actually could go red that no one is paying any attention to is the state of New Hampshire, which is my home state. They did some really unique things this year with their election laws. They moved away from mail-in ballots entirely. They have a requirement for voter ID in New Hampshire. They have no mail-in ballots or very few mail-in ballots. So that's a big change from what they had in the last couple elections. If you go back to 2016, Trump didn't lose by a whole lot in 2016 in New Hampshire. And if you look at the polls, some polls show New Hampshire with Trump losing by like 4 or 5 points. But Rasmussen just did a poll on Tuesday that showed Trump down by 1 in the state of New Hampshire, which if you apply my analysis to it would mean that Trump would end up winning. So I think it's actually possible that Trump could do even better than what I have in here, and I have it as a landslide. So I guess if I was going to say the one state that I'm worried about the most, or the two states I'm worried about the most, I would say are Pennsylvania and Michigan. The reason for that is because Michigan is just more reliably blue than all the other swing states we're talking about here, except for maybe Nevada. That's pretty reliably blue as well, but I think Trump's doing pretty well there. Michigan, I am worried about. And Pennsylvania, I'm worried about because if you look at the pollsters from the last presidential election, that was actually the state they did the best in at getting it accurate. So they were wrong, wildly wrong in many states. Like in Wisconsin, they had Trump losing by like 5 percentage points. They ended up only losing by, I don't know, it was like 11,000 votes or something like that, 13,000 votes, very small, fraction of a percentage point. So they've got most of the states wildly wrong. Pennsylvania was the state that they actually did the best in. And so that's the one I'm worried about the most, just because it's so close there in the polls, and the pollsters seem to have done a better job in that state than in others. But overall, I think in the vast majority of places, if you just follow the polls and you just look at how the last two presidential elections have gone and you apply that analysis to this one, Trump's going to win in a landslide. It may be even bigger than, what the biggest pro-Trump people are saying. And I think that Kamala Harris's internal polling suggests that that's the case as well. That's why we're seeing her do all this media that's suddenly out of nowhere. The last month, she's suddenly available after not being available at all. That's why they're moving frantically into the Trump's a Hitler thing again after he got shot in the head and survived. And I thought we were going to move away and tone down the rhetoric. And now we're calling him Hitler and saying he's hosting Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden. I think all of that is desperation. They know they're losing. They're in huge trouble. They have to do something. I think the Bret Baier interview was also a massive, massive, massive indicator that they have internal polling in the Harris camp that says that they're losing, because there's no way Kamala Harris goes on Fox News and does an interview with Bret Baier, not even for 15 minutes, if she thinks that she's going to win. There's just zero chance she does that. And so I think she believes she's losing. I think she is losing. I think it's highly unlikely that she wins this race. And I think, like Jack said earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean we're not going to have turmoil. We probably will have massive turmoil in the wake of that. But I do think that we're set up right now for Donald Trump winning in a landslide.
Let's see. Let's go to Jim. Jim, are you more rosy than Justin, or less? Let's see.
Possible. Not possible.
Slightly less, it looks like.
Slightly less, yeah. I mean, I think I'm going to give one of the Great Lakes states to Kamala Harris. I have it here as giving her Michigan. I think Donald Trump's going to win Pennsylvania. And why not just throw Wisconsin in there narrowly for Trump as well? He is going to win all of the so-called Sun Belt states, that being Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. There is, in fact, I think, Justin, we had up there earlier the Real Clear Politics battleground state. Real Clear Politics, cumulative average in the battleground states. And I think Georgia is actually not even going to be particularly close. And if we have an honest media, they will call it pretty early. So I'm being conservative in my estimation. I think it can be a comfortable and significant win. But one thing I'm actually really curious about is that and Justin, you'll know this as well. I mean, Jack and Donnie as well. You all know this, that the national vote, which I pay almost no attention to because that doesn't matter in our elections. What matters is this map that you see, the Electoral College. Winning these states is what matters. But the fact that the national average, that the national polling has it so close, I think Kamala's only up by maybe 1% or 2%. When in the 2016 and the 2020 election, the popular vote was significantly in favor of the Democrat. So yeah. I think there is actually what we might even see on election night, and when all the votes are counted, is that Donald Trump has a chance to win the popular vote, because as Justin said, he tends to be undercounted in polling. And so if what they can count in the national average is accurate, or at least accurate enough, could you imagine a Tuesday or Wednesday morning waking up and realizing that a majority of Americans across the country have chosen to vote against Kamala Harris and the insanity of the left that controls the Democratic Party, and voted for sanity and a return to normalcy through the very imperfect vessel of one Donald Trump?
Yeah, let me just give the numbers on that since Jim brought it up. This is to the day in history. So 5 days prior to the election, these are the numbers, the last two presidential elections. 2016, at this point, Clinton was up by 1.3 percentage points in the national poll. Okay, so national polling. Biden was up by 7.4 percentage points in the national polling. And right now, Trump is up 0.4 percentage points. So
Wow.
very narrow. But you got to remember, again, last election, I didn't get a chance to say this line that I've said for 1,000 times over the past year. Last election, Donald Trump lost by a combined total of fewer than 50,000 votes in 3 swing states. That's it. And he was losing in the polls at this point in time last year by 7.4 percentage points. And he's winning in the polls right now by 0.4 percentage points. And he's winning in almost all the battleground states. So when you just take that into consideration, it seems almost impossible. The only way I'm wrong is if the pollsters did way better this time, way more accurate this time than last time. In fact, they would actually have to be, no, that's not even true because Trump is winning still under that scenario. They would have to be inaccurate, but in favor of Donald Trump this time.
Right.
So in other words, they're oversampling Donald Trump voters. They're making it look like Trump's going to win, but he's not really going to win, which would be the first time in my life that that's ever happened. And I just can't, for the Republican presidential candidate, I just can't believe that that is a reasonable position to take. It could be true, but that's not a reasonable position to take 5 days out from the election. So it is entirely possible that Trump could win the national popular vote. I don't think it will happen, but it's entirely possible. And that would be incredible. A Republican has not won the national popular vote since George W. Bush. So huge thing if Trump does do that.
All right, Andy, you can show my map, but this won't be the most intriguing thing because it is identical to Justin's map. I also have for basically the same reason. There was no coordination between Justin. That's not my map. That's Jim's map. I had Michigan also going red. I had 312 to whatever the math is on that one. But I will say that I have my own prediction, and I'll open this up to any like prop bets that anyone wants to make. But here's my prediction. I think we'll have a declared winner. I think we'll have a concession speech before we are live on Thursday. In fact, I think that we'll have a concession speech maybe even on election night, but I'll hedge my bet a little bit and say at least by the end of Wednesday. So that's my big everyone's like, oh, we're gonna have to wait 10 days to get all the votes. No. I think this is gonna be a sure thing. Like by the time we go to bed on Tuesday, I think we'll have it all wrapped up by Wednesday night officially.
Here's why I think that is entirely possible that's true. It's entirely possible this gets dragged out for weeks and weeks and weeks, and we have riots in the streets and people are, burning things and whatever. That's entirely possible and perhaps even likely. But I think that the best case for that is if you just look at all the different scenarios that involve Kamala Harris winning, they all involve winning Pennsylvania for the most part. It's almost impossible for her to win without Pennsylvania. Trump is polling very well in Pennsylvania, and that's where he got shot in the head and survived. And so there's a pretty good chance if he wins, if he's winning in Pennsylvania handedly, it's pretty much over. And we're going to know that. We could know that. It's possible we'll know that early on. Now, it's also possible that we're going to get all these floods of mail-in ballots that come in after the fact and everything else, and there could be all sorts of craziness in Pennsylvania. But if it looks like he's winning by a lot, then I could see the so-called polling experts a day later saying, you know what? It looks like he won Pennsylvania, and therefore it's highly unlikely she's going to win, so we declare it. So I think that's a pretty good bet, but that's really the prop bet. It's not whether we all agree Trump's going to win. It sounds like The real question is this going to be dragged out for weeks on end? Or is this going to be resolved within the first week? I think that should be the real bet that.
Oh yeah, I mean that
taking
is
into
the real
account
bet. There's a line from the great boxing movie Cinderella Man, where the final match is going down to the cards and the judges are making their decisions, and the corner man for the protagonist of the story is like, "Oh, if they're taking this long because they're going to screw somebody." And I feel like the longer it gets dragged out, the more likely that's the case. We're approaching an hour and a half. Gentlemen, any last bets or predictions or anything that you want to put on the record to make yourself look silly 1 week from today?
No, I have one more thing that I wanted to add that I should have told you about this, but I totally forgot. This is incredible. And we really should have done a better job of doing. Maybe we could do something on this later next week or something. But I got a letter in the mail from something called the Turnout Project. Okay, which is a progressive turnout project. All right. And I just want to read to you just a couple lines from this letter. All right. It's reminding me that I got my ballot in the mail because that's how they do things in this crazy state. But listen to how creepy the language is here. Okay. So they tell me, we just sent you you just got your ballot in the mail. You know, you should have received it. Remember to vote by 8 p.m. on election day. And then it says this in bold. It's the only bold line in the whole letter. It says, remember, scan here for Dropbox locations. Remember that who you vote for is private, but whether you vote is public information. Okay. Then it says, we will be checking public records again after the election. And I hope that I will have the opportunity to thank you for voting.
Oh, creepy.
Now that creeped me out so much. Like, you're going to be checking on whether I voted or not. And you're going to make sure, remember, I don't know who you voted for, but make sure to remember that we know whether you voted or not. And we'll be checking after the election's over. So creepy, just absolutely bizarre. So what? No, I know, Stephen A. I know. So I'm really creeped out by that. But yeah, right. I just should have brought that up earlier, but I forgot.
Well, that's it, everyone. That was the final episode before election 2024. How excited are we? I hope that I have this same face on, 1 week from today, and the enthusiasm that I expressed during this episode. We will see. Jim reacted as if I was announcing the last show of the show ever. That's not the case. I hope that's not the case. Although, depending on what happens on Tuesday, maybe that will be the case. I don't know. But yeah, that'll do it. I want to thank everyone for tuning into this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Join us every week for a new episode. If you are an audio-only listener, you're probably catching the show on a Friday or a day later or whatever. Write a review for us on iTunes. Also, consider joining us a day earlier on Thursdays at noon Central Time, where we are live streaming this on Facebook and YouTube and Rumble and X. And you can join the conversation, throw your comments and questions in the chat. Maybe we'll share your comments on the screen. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. You can also help out the show by going to heartland.org/inthetank and donating that way, because we have been demonetized by YouTube, but going and throwing a few bucks that way is better because YouTube doesn't take a 30% cut. You could also support the show just by hitting that like button, sharing the content, subscribing if you haven't already, leaving a comment under the video. All those things help break through the big tech algorithms that prevent content like this from being shown to more people. You can follow us on X at InTheTankPod. You can send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to the show by emailing us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Jim Lakely, where can the fine people find you?
At JLakely on X, at Heartland Inst on X, and always visit heartland.org.
Fantastic. Justin Haskins, same question.
At Justin T. Haskins on X.
Ooh, all right, short and brief. And Jack McFarland, allegedly his fourth time on this episode. Don't think so.
Well, first time on the episode, but fifth time maybe on the show.
Oh, okay, got it. Anything
just heartland.org. Just heartland.org for me. I don't have social media, and I don't ever intend to have it.
Sounds good to me. All right, thank you all for tuning in, and we will talk to you next week.
Trump!